Kalen Duskwood had never questioned himself. Not once. Not when he took the throne at 22 after his father fell in battle. Not when he rebuilt his kingdom from the inside out, brick by brick, law by law. And certainly not when he picked up the war decree 3 weeks ago and pressed his seal into the wax without blinking. He was a king. Kings did not question. They decided. So when he stood at the head of his army, at the Embervale border, on a cold gray morning, watching the distant tree line for the first movement of enemy forces, he told himself that he felt nothing except certainty. The Ashvale pack had been a thorn in his kingdom's side for 6 long years. They had raided his borders. They had smuggled dangerous weapons into his territory, and 6 years ago, 6 years that still burned in his chest every single morning, they had taken the one person he had loved most in the world. Luna Celeste was gone because of them. And today, he was going to make that mean something. The fog was heavy across the open field. His horse shifted under him, restless. Around him, 10,000 soldiers stood in silent, perfectly ordered lines. Captain Orrin Dusk, his closest general and oldest friend, rode up quietly beside him. "They're moving," Orrin said simply. Kalen looked up. Across the field, through the gray morning light, the Ashvale forces were emerging from the tree line, organized, calm, and moving into position with a discipline that surprised him. He had expected panic. He had expected a pack running on fear. What he saw instead was an army that had clearly done this before. And then he saw her. She rode at the front of the enemy lines, alone, slightly ahead of the rest, the way a commander rides when she wants her soldiers to see that she is not afraid. Her armor was silver gray and fitted precisely. Her dark hair was pulled back. She was giving orders with small, quiet gestures of her hand, and the soldiers around her moved immediately, without question, without hesitation. Kalen's wolf woke up. That was the only way he could describe it. For 3 years, the wolf inside him, the deep, ancient part of his soul that every werewolf carried, had been silent. After Celeste died, it had simply gone quiet, like a fire that had run out of wood. He had stopped expecting to feel it again. He had made his peace with that silence. But now, in the space of one single breath, it was not silent anymore. It was roaring. The word it sent through him was not complicated. It was not careful or cautious or diplomatic. It was one word, said the way a wolf says things, completely, without doubt, without any room for argument. Mine. Kalen went completely still. Orrin noticed. "Your Majesty?" he said, low and careful. Kalen did not answer. He could not, just then. Because across the field something strange was happening. The woman at the head of the enemy forces had stopped moving. Her horse had stopped, and her head had turned, slowly, until she was looking, not at his army, not at the landscape, not at the fog, but directly at him. Even at this distance he felt it, like a rope pulled tight between two people who had no business being connected. Her name was Seraphine Voss, and she had built her entire life on the simple principle that feelings were a luxury she could not afford. She was 27 years old. She had been a soldier since she was 16, a commander since she was 22, and the head of Ashvale's military since last winter. She had never lost a battle. She had never run from a fight. She had never, not once, let anything personal get in the way of what needed to be done. She had not expected today to be any different. When the war decree from Ironvale had arrived 3 weeks ago, she had read it once, set it down, asked her lieutenants to leave the tent, and spent 3 minutes in silence before she began planning. She did not panic. She did not feel sorry for herself or for her pack. She simply began working out how a smaller, lighter force could make a war with a larger one too expensive to continue. That was what she did. That was who she was. She solved problems. She had not planned for this. Her wolf, Lyra, the quiet and steady companion she had carried inside her since childhood, had never been dramatic. Lyra did not make sudden announcements. She did not speak in commands. But as Seraphine rode into position at the front of her forces on that cold gray morning, Lyra did something she had never done before. She pulled, hard, toward the line of soldiers on the opposite side of the field. Toward one soldier in particular. Seraphine's gaze found him without her permission. The rider at the front of the Iron Veil forces, tall on his horse, dark armor, absolutely still in the way that only someone truly powerful manages to be still. She recognized him from the portraits in the military briefings. She knew exactly who he was. Alpha King Kalen Duskwood, the man who had declared war on her people. The man whose forces had burned a village near the Embervale crossing 6 years ago, the same night she lost her parents and her younger sister. She had every reason to feel anger when she looked at him. Instead, Lyra whispered, with absolute calm, "Ours." Seraphine's jaw went tight. She pulled her gaze away. She turned to her second-in-command, her brother Rhett, and said in a perfectly even voice, "Hold the line until I give the signal." "Understood," Rhett said, studying her face with the sharp eyes of someone who knew her better than almost anyone. "You all right?" "Always," she said, and she turned back to face the field. The battle did not begin. 10 minutes passed. 20. The fog thinned slightly. Both armies held their positions. The birds in the nearby trees went quiet, as though they too were waiting to see what would happen. What happened was this. The Alpha King raised his hand, signaled a pause to his forces, and rode out alone into the open ground between the two armies. Rhett made a sound beside Seraphine that was almost a word. "I see it," she said quietly. She watched for a moment, then she said, "Stay here," to Rhett in a tone that ended the conversation before it started. She rode out to meet him. They stopped a short distance apart. Up close, the bond was not gentle or warm the way the old stories described. It was heavy, serious, like standing next to something enormous, and trying to decide whether to be afraid of it or not. Kalen looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke for what felt like a long time. "I know what this is," he said finally. His voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it was not controlled at all. "I want you to know that it does not change what I came here to do." Seraphine looked at him steadily. "If that were true," she said, "you would not have ridden out here alone." He had no answer for that. She could see it in the slight shift of his expression, the thing that happens to people when someone says something true that they were not ready to hear. She turned her horse and rode back to her lines. Behind her, she heard nothing. No charge, no command, no war beginning. Just silence, and the sound of the wind moving across the empty field between them. An ancient law, older than both kingdoms, required that when fated mates stood on opposite sides of a declared conflict, both packs had to enter a 3-day mediation period before any battle could legally begin. High Elder Marin, a neutral party respected by both kingdoms, invoked it before sunset. Kalen and Seraphine were escorted to a neutral lodge on the border with their senior advisors. They were given separate rooms and a shared common area. They were expected to talk. For the first 12 hours, talking was the last thing either of them was willing to do. They worked instead. Side by side at a long table covered in maps, they addressed the actual terms of the conflict, border boundaries, the smuggling intelligence, the series of raids that had brought them here. They were precise. They were professional. They disagreed on nearly every point, and they disagreed clearly, without raising their voices, which somehow made the disagreements feel more serious than shouting would have. Seraphine knew her facts cold. She always did. Kalen found, somewhat against his will, that she was not wrong about any of them. Her data was better than his in several places. When he pointed this out, she simply nodded and moved on, as though being right was not something she needed to be recognized for. It was just something she needed to be. He found that strangely difficult to look away from. On the second night, he could not sleep. He sat alone in the common room, holding a small portrait, worn at the corners, the paint slightly faded. Celeste, as she had looked at 23, smiling at something outside the frame of the image. He did not hear Seraphine come in. She moved quietly, always. She stopped when she saw him, and he expected her to leave. Instead, she said, from across the room, "Who is she?" He thought about not answering. Then he said, "Her name was Celeste. She was going to be my Luna. She was killed 6 years ago in a border raid." He paused. "By Ashvale soldiers." The room was very quiet. Seraphine walked to the table and sat down across from him. She looked at the portrait for a moment, then at him. "Where did it happen?" she asked. Her voice was different now, careful, in the way of someone walking on uncertain ground. He told her. The crossing near the old Embervale mill. The eastern route. Late autumn, 6 years ago. Seraphine was still for a long time. My family died that night, she said quietly. At the same crossing. My parents. My younger sister. She looked at the table, not at him. I spent 2 years afterward trying to understand what happened. The evidence never matched the official record. The attack patterns were wrong for Ashvale soldiers. The timing was wrong. The targets were wrong. She stopped. I was told to let it go. Kalen set the portrait down very carefully. What did the patterns match? He asked. She met his eyes. A third party, she said. Someone who wanted both of us looking at each other, instead of looking at them. They did not sleep that night. They called for High Elder Marin before midnight. By the time the sun came up, the three of them had reconstructed what had actually happened 6 years ago, using Marin's records, Seraphine's old investigative notes, and the intelligence files Kalen had brought from his own archives. A group called the Silverthorn Collective, a mercenary organization that had been quietly moving between Pack territories for over a decade, had carried out the attack. They had done it carefully, leaving just enough trace evidence to point toward Ashvale. Their goal was simple: push Ironvale and Ashvale into a war that would exhaust both packs, and then take the Embervale territory, while neither side had the strength to defend it. Celeste and Seraphine's family had not been accidents. They had been chosen. Two people who, if they had lived, would have had every reason to build peace between the two kingdoms rather than war. Kalen sat with this for a long time. Seraphine did not rush him. She sat across from him and waited, because she understood, better than almost anyone, what it felt like to have the story you had built your grief around collapse underneath you. When he finally looked up, his voice was quiet and completely stripped of the careful control he usually kept around it like a wall. I owe your people an apology, he said. I owe you one too. She held his gaze. She had expected to feel triumph at hearing those words from him. She had thought it would feel like winning. It did not feel like winning. It felt like watching something heavy finally be set down after being carried for far too long. Start with your counsel, she said. Tell them the truth, all of it. She paused. We can figure out the rest after. On the morning of the 4th day, Kalen stood in front of both armies at the Embervale border and withdrew the war declaration. He did not use careful language or political phrasing. He said, simply and clearly, that the intelligence behind the war was false, that the Ashvale Pack was not responsible for what happened 6 years ago, and that the true enemy was still out there, and would require both kingdoms to face it together. His general stood very still. His council would not be pleased. He did not particularly care. Seraphine watched from horseback beside Rhett, who had his arms crossed and his expression set in the way it got when he was deciding how to feel about something. I don't trust him, Rhett said. I know, she said. Do you? She was quiet for a moment. Across the field, Kalen had finished speaking and was standing in the silence that followed, the kind of silence that comes after something large and true has been said out loud. I trust what I saw, she said at last. And I trust what I know. That's enough to start with. She rode forward. She rode to the center of the field and stopped beside him, in front of both armies, in front of 10,000 soldiers from two kingdoms who were watching and slowly beginning to understand what they were seeing. She did not make a speech. She simply stopped her horse beside his and faced forward, and let the truth of what they were to each other be visible to anyone who cared to look. The soldiers felt it. Even those who did not understand the mate bond felt something shift in the air, a weight lifting that they had not realized they had been carrying. The months that followed were not easy ones. Peace never builds itself quickly or quietly, and there were people on both sides who had invested too much in the idea of war to let it go without a fight. The Silverthorn Collective, now exposed, moved harder and faster to protect themselves. There were difficult negotiations, long nights, and more than a few moments when the new alliance nearly came apart. Kalen and Seraphine faced all of it together, not because it was simple. It was never simple. Not because they always agreed. They almost never did. But they were both people who had learned to carry hard things, and carrying hard things together turned out to be very different from carrying them alone. The Silverthorn Collective was dismantled before winter. Their leaders faced justice under a joint council, the first time Ironvale and Ashvale had ever sat at the same table to make a decision together. At the Embervale crossing, the same ground where they had each lost someone they loved, years apart, to the same hidden enemy, both kingdoms built a memorial. Simple stone, no long explanations, just the names of those who had been taken. Celeste's name was on it. So were the names of Seraphine's parents and her younger sister. They stood there together on the morning it was completed. The wind was cold. The sky was clear. Seraphine stood with her hands in her pockets and her eyes on the stone, and Kaelin stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. They would have hated each other, she said. He glanced at her. "You're Luna and my mother," she said. "Strong women always need time to decide to like each other." The corner of her mouth lifted, just slightly. They would have come around. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, he said, "Yes, I think they would have." That evening, under a full moon at the binding grounds, ancient and quiet and lit by silver light, they made their bond permanent. Rhett was there, standing at his sister's side without complaint. Orin was there, as he had been at every important moment of Kaelin's life. High Elder Marin stood at the center and spoke the old words, and the bond that had been pulling at both of them since that cold gray morning on the battlefield settled into something solid and real, and finally, fully theirs. It was not the story either of them had planned. Kaelin had planned on justice. Seraphine had planned on survival. Neither of them had planned on this, on standing in moonlight with someone who understood exactly what they had lost and exactly what they had built, and who chose them anyway. But the best things, they had both learned by now, were rarely the things you planned for. They were the things that found you, across a battlefield, through 6 years of grief, past every wall you had ever built, and simply refused to go away.